a man, who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Back when I had a job, we would on occasion catch a huge load of illegal stuff. Huge as in a ton or more. Once everybody was either in handcuffs or back in Mexico, it was the thing to take a few hero shots. Everybody involved in the arrest would line up and we would get a few photos taken. Just about every image of me, I'm holding a coffee cup. I don't know if this was my lucky coffee cup, but it did bring me joy in life, so probably it was. If you want or need a lucky coffee cup, all you need to do is get a hold of a cup and fill it with Organic Man Coffee Trike coffee. Drop by 4501 McPherson and fill up a cup or two. Then see what happens. You can also order online by going to organicmancoffeetrike.shop and get the best coffee in the universe delivered to your front door. Star Chaser 2000 sent me an email. She was passing on a few UFO sightings and she told me about a book she was reading by Louis Lamar called The Haunted Mesa. In the book, the author writes of people and ships that disappeared all over the world, including an entire army that vanished in China. The Chinese army struck a chord, and I was convinced I'd done a show on it sometime in the past. I did some digging, and I found out that the show was back in 2019. I find it hard to realize it's 2024, nearly 25. What happened to December 21st, 2012? Mayans, end of the world. Folks coming out on Coast to Coast, like Doctor Doom, or telling us how, or no, it was Major Doom, wasn't it? Telling us about how the world was going to end and there wasn't a darn thing we could do about it. Books and movies and all kinds of things telling us about the Mayans and the end of the world. And then it kind of went poof and nothing happened. We all woke up December 22nd and, well, we were still here. Of course, Scholar's Coffee Shop did close at that time. It took 3 years for Julio to replace and then exceed them. I wonder what happened to Gerardo and Carmen. I knew where they lived, and I stopped by a couple of times and rung the bell, and I left my business card, and I even wrote them a couple of notes and left it under the windshields of their vehicles. They vanished, as if maybe the Mayans were talking about them. That would be a bit scary. I went back and I looked at these mass vanishings to see if I could find anything new about them. See what I could find that I hadn't already mentioned. You have to admit the idea of a bunch of people all stepping from point A into I don't know where can be frightening. I hoped I could find a new item or two to add to these stories instead of simply rehashing the original show. What with it being Christmas and all, I was doing a lot of things other than preparing for the podcast. I think I might have baked a couple of hundred cookies. We go around the neighborhood handing out bags full of cookies to all of our neighbors. And then our neighbors go around handing out various dessert items as well. And our neighborhood is a community. It's not just a bunch of people living in houses that wave to each other once in a while. During the Black Plague of 2020, we walked around the neighborhood asking everybody if there was anything they needed. If we had it, we were more than willing to share. And our neighbors came by asking if there was anything we wanted or needed. And we're more of a community than most places. Now, people vanish all the time. They disappear while on their own or sometimes within sight of their friends. You'd think the best way to not vanish would be to stay in a group. Safety in numbers. Back when I had a job, it was common thing to park in some out of the way location and then take a walk along the river, see what you might find. There were things buried in the ground that would let us know if the bad people were crossing in certain areas, but these things were only put in places where we knew there was activity. In order to know there was activity, somebody had to go look. So a lot of times we would spend hours walking up down the riverbank trying to see if we could find one of these locations. And a lot of times it was just us all on our own. I'm surprised we never lost anybody. The only person that knew where we were was the radio operator, and the nearest backup was usually 30 to 60 minutes away. Yes, I was armed, but then all of the people in the following stories were not just armed, they were heavily armed. And yet, it seems to have done them absolutely no good. I did several shows about people vanishing from the face of the earth with no known cause. Tonight, I'm going to talk about mass disappearances, large groups of people who all vanish together, bringing up the idea there's no safe place anywhere on the planet, whether you're alone or in a group. Like I said, I tried to do a new show here, but unfortunately, there's only so much out there to be found on these subjects, and I had a very limited week. Like I said, several hundred cookies had to be baked, and then we had to go around and visit all the neighbors. So, hope you enjoy tonight's show. If you don't, too bad. I'm sorry. No, I'm not. Way back in time, when the Romans ruled most of the Middle East and a lot of Europe as well, they knew how to destroy their enemies. They had invented a thing called a ballista that could launch a spear 500 yards. That's 5 times the length of a football field. This was the equivalent of a sniper's rifle back in the day. An enemy leader would be far away from the action, secure in knowing that nobody could reach out and touch him. Along comes a bolt faster than the eye can focus, and the leader's Kaputski, nailed to a tree several yards behind where he'd been standing. When it came to killing, the Romans were top hat. A Greek phalanx had developed a way of fighting that was nearly impossible to defeat. Soldiers would line up in 5 rows, shoulder to shoulder. The front rank was all holding huge round shields made out of wood. These things were a bit heavy and hard to maneuver, but they weren't there to be maneuvered, they were there for safety. The next 4 ranks had 18-foot spears held out past the wall of shields. It was a wall of sharp, pointy things. 4 layers of spears, all pointed in the same direction. It was nearly impossible to get through such a mass. Any army charging this wall of spears would wind up getting themselves impaled. The ranks would begin marching forward, pushing any adversaries away or inflicting a lot of damage. The Romans looked at the Greek spear wall and they had an idea. They used that great big wooden shield that was actually made out of plywood, very light and very sturdy. Then they were armed with a short sword called a gladius. The Romans would march right up to the first bunch of spear points and then turn to the right. The oblong shield would push the spear to the side, trapping the Greek soldiers in the middle as the spear shafts all were forced together. Then, as the Romans got close enough, they used the gladius to poke and prod the Greeks into either surrendering or stop breathing. Each Roman legion was arranged in the same configuration. A soldier could go from one camp to another and know exactly where everything was. Soldiers trained to the same guidelines, so each army would work side by side, knowing what those on the right and those on the left were going to do. A spear is both a fighting weapon and a throwing weapon. The trouble is, if you throw a spear at your enemies, well, they pick it up and throw it back. The Romans made a spear that had a wide point on a long, skinny metal shaft. The wide point would poke through a shield, but then there was no resistance to slow the spear down once the larger tip had gone through, and it would go right through a shield. The long metal shaft was designed that as soon as it had done its job, it would bend, making the spear useless to throw back. After the battle, the men would go around and they'd collect all of these bent spears and they'd take them to a blacksmith who would then straighten them all out and get ready for the next battle. As the Roman army would conquer a territory, the people living there would become part of Rome, not citizens, but subjects. Roman soldiers would be from every country under this empire. Being in the army was a good thing. To begin with, it was a steady job. The soldiers built things when not destroying other things. They were paid better than most folks who worked for a living. They received the best medical treatment since a strong army meant a strong empire. They did get moved around a lot as rebellions broke out. For a while there, the men were not allowed to get married. Their loyalties were to Rome and no one else. The Ninth Roman Legion was from Spain. In 43 AD, Rome invaded what is now the British Isles. To maintain order and see to it the taxes were collected, the Ninth Legion was sent to Britannia. Most of what is now England was under Roman rule. However, that land to the north, that is now known as Scotland, was not just wild, it was untamable. The mighty Roman army was unable to control the Picts. The Picts got their name from drawing on their skin with blue dye. These drawings were called picts or pictures. Seeing a group of wild men and women, the Roman soldiers decided it was a good idea to build a bunch of forts running from coast to coast. This was not Hadrian's Wall, but it was close to where it was going to be. Hadrian's Wall was made from stone and it was moved north a few times so that emperors could claim they had increased the size of Rome, even if it was only by a few yards. A legion was about 6,000 men, depending on how long ago they'd been in combat. If a century was really hammered in battle, they might be moved to someplace less volatile, but their numbers would not be increased. No sense putting new men in an old, beat up, unbattle ready unit. The Ninth Legion was made up of battle hardened men who had seen action in Germany, Greece, and Africa. When you first joined the Roman army, you were issued, which is not the right word, your basic kit. The cost was deducted from your pay for the next year or so. Should you retire or leave for whatever reason, the gear was yours. You paid for it. If you got called up for a military campaign, you were expected to show up with all your gear and be ready to fight. Not to get ready, you were expected to already be ready. You put on your PBS, that's pistol belt and stuff. Okay, there was no pistol, but you put on your gear and then you had to take a physical training test to make sure that you were ready. You had to have all your gear on, all your sleeping gear, your cooking utensils, everything that the military had issued you. You had to have it all tied to your body. And then you had to go 18.4 miles in 5 hours. If you made it, well, you were now back in the Army. If you didn't make it, bad things were coming your way. You were pretty much going to be forced to either improve yourself or go looking for a new job somewhere. The Ninth was briefly disbanded, and then they were called back up during the rebellion of Sextus Pompeius in Sicily. Aren't you glad we don't have names like that anymore? The thing about soldiers is they do mostly what they're supposed to do, just about all the time. People do not join the military with hopes of leading some kind of sedentary life. It's the action and the spoils of war that they're looking for. When Caesar said go to Britannia, the Ninth went. Roman soldiers did a lot more than march around killing people. They built roads and fortifications, and they came up with new weapons. Back in Britannia, the Ninth Legion got busy doing what they were there to do. In 50 AD, the Ninth was one of two legions that defeated the forces of Caratacus at Circorotic. That same year, the legion constructed a fort, Lindum Colonia, at Lincoln. Under the command of Caesius Nasica, they put down the first revolt of Venutius between 52 and 57. The Ninth suffered a serious defeat under Quintus Petilius Cerilius in the rebellion of Boudica in 61 AD. You may recognize that name. If you don't, you need to read more history. And they had to be reinforced with legionnaires from Germania province. Around 71 AD, they constructed a new fort in York. Having soldiers from all over Europe, this led to a lot of different languages being spoken. Not a problem because the folks in charge all spoke Latin. Soldiers did not need to communicate directly with each other. The Roman Emperor Hadrian wanted that land to the north of Britain. So in 110 AD, he sent the Ninth up to pound the locals into submission. Something like 6,000 men, all their equipment, and the camp followers headed north out of York. Probably about 8,000 people in all. Now, the Roman army had done away with most of the camp followers in order to make the military more self sufficient. But there were always folks who were needed to sew things and clean things and stop the bleeding and fix things. The ladies of negotiable affections would pose as being seamstresses or cooks or washing women, anything to stay close to the customers. There's no record of what happened to them after that. 6,000 men and a few thousand camp followers. That's a lot of bodies to simply make vanish. Each soldier had 65 to 70 pounds of gear. 390,000 pounds. That's just in personal gear. The Legion would have had wagon mounted weapons and horses, farriers, blacksmiths, with all of their equipment. There would have been at least 60 standards, those flags showing which units were which. Had the Ninth encountered a superior force, seeing as the Picts did not play well with others, there should have been a collection of these banners or the vexillum somewhere in the area. Somebody would have collected these things and hung a few on their wall. The Picts were not big on writing things down. To them, it was the thing to pass on stories by oral tradition. The old guy, somebody like me, somebody who wasn't much good for fighting or hunting, would stay in the village and remember things. Hopefully, things that had actually happened. Every so often, oh, say when the cable was down or the kids were bored, the old man, or sometimes even the old woman, would be poked with a stick and asked to tell the kids about the time great granddad took on the Roman army. Somebody would have hung on to some kind of memento from the battle, but no, there's no oral record or any artifacts to look at and understand what happened in the year AD 110. There should be some record somewhere saying what became of the Ninth, but there's nothing. Shortly after the Ninth disappeared into what is now known as Scotland, Emperor Hadrian had the Roman army build a wall across the island to keep those crazy people to the north away from the folks living in the south. What happened to the Ninth Roman Legion that not only wiped them out, but scared the emperor into not wanting to head north ever again? The Celtic tribes living in the area were not organized. They fought each other as much as they fought the Romans. How could a bunch of disorganized tribes defeat a legion of Roman soldiers? And what happened to the bodies and the equipment? It's almost like the ground opened up and swallowed over 6,000 men and all their gear. Did you see the movie Gallipoli? Good movie. It was about the British trying to capture and hold the Dardanelles Straits. This would have given Brits access to the Black Sea, and they could have attacked the German lines from the rear. This was during World War I. The Russians were dissatisfied with the whole dying for the motherland, and they were looking to pull out. If this happened, the German and Austrian armies would have had only one front to pour all their attention into. The Turks had sided with the Germans and they had dug in on both sides of the straits. The Turks had artillery on both sides of this body of water, and the water was filled with mines. The British and the French sent in their old, worn out navy ships figuring any losses would not affect the main navy. Those sailors were cheap and easy to replace. After bombarding the Turkish positions for hours, the Navy was surprised to discover the artillery was still there. The Turks would simply move their guns away from where the Navy shells were landing, wait for the shelling to stop, and then move everything right back into position. After losing several old ships, the High Command decided that A, the Turks must be getting low on ammo, and B, what they needed was ground troops to walk in and take over. Boots on the ground, as they like to say. A military unit created by King Edward VII and known as the 5th Battalion Norfolk Regiment, the Sandringhams, or more commonly simply known as the Norfolks, was put together from men who worked for the king on the Sandringham estate. These recruits were from the king's workforce. The royals in Britain own everything, and the commoners work for them, and they live on land only if they're allowed to by the folks that own everything. What a system. Add to this, the royal British family were all from Germany, and it makes you wonder. Their last name was Mountbatten until it was suggested that they change it to something less Germanic, seeing as the British were fighting the Germans. The men who signed up to fight for God and country all lived in the same towns and they grew up together. Nearly every man over the age of 17 and under 50 joined and trained together, and when duty called, they went off to fight together. The Norfolks were transported from England to the Mediterranean. They arrived at the British front lines on August 10th, 1915. England is a cool climate. These men were now in the Middle East, where it was hot and dry. The Norfolk Regiment was made up of 16 officers, 250 men, led by Sir Horace Proctor Beauchamp. Many of the men were suffering from seasickness. Some had come down with dysentery. Dysentery is a really bad case of food poisoning. 2 days later, while still suffering from seasickness and dysentery and this horrible change in climate, uh, they were sent into battle. The maps used by the British High Command were way off. Nobody really knew the area or how well dug in the Turks were. There was a lack of drinking water and not nearly enough supplies. The High Command was focusing most of their attention, as well as most of the supplies, on the real fighting in Europe. The Turks knew the area well and they had fought a few battles there already. Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal was familiar with the Gallipoli Peninsula from his operations against the Bulgarians in the Balkan Wars. His army was equipped with detailed maps showing any defensive locations and how to utilize them to their fullest. The British High Command had maps drawn up mostly out of guesswork while looking at the coast through binoculars. The Turks were being supplied by the Germans, who were making all kinds of goodies that could be used to kill people. They also had German officers on their side at the battle, giving advice. The Norfolks were under the impression that they were going to attack a village called Anafarta Saga. Try saying that without laughing. They had no idea that the Turks were not only dug in there, but they were well acclimatized to the heat. They had plenty of water, and they had plenty of supplies. The battle plans of the days were: unload your rifle. You're not supposed to stop and shoot, and the soldiers might accidentally shoot one of their own men. There was no round carried in the chamber. They would fix bayonets, wait for the signal, and everybody would jump out of the trenches and run at the bad guys, who are sitting behind defensive barriers, had lots of bullets, and were able to use them. With men running straight into oncoming machine gun fire, as well as high explosive shells going off all around, the battlefield would quickly turn into a lot of smoke and debris. Anything made of wood would catch fire, adding a lot of smoke to the field. The guy in charge was expected to keep an eye on the regiment on his right, and keep an eye on the regiment on his left, and keep all of his men together in a group and the same line of attack, while at the same time trying to not trip over anything or get himself shot. All of this while the Turks did their best to kill everyone. The men of the Norfolk Regiment managed to get ahead of the regiments on either side of them. In the ensuing confusion, they got turned around and began running in the wrong direction. The commanding officers managed to get the troops headed in the right direction, only to find that none of the rest of the British Army was anywhere to be seen. At some point in the attack, they must have realized their mistake. When you look right and left and you don't see any of your fellow soldiers, you kind of realize you're on your own. The men continued to advance towards Kavik Tepe without reinforcements or support. They were met with a rain of machine gun fire, and numerous snipers were taking them out one by one. Somehow, Colonel Beaucamp and the Norfolk Regiment managed to push the Turks back into a forest. Artillery fire from the British rear lines had started the woods on fire. The Norfolks continued into the burning forest, and that was the last anyone ever saw of any of them. By the end of the day, the British High Command gathered their reports and looked at what was left of their troops. They soon realized that the Norfolk Regiment was missing. Everybody agreed that the Turkish army must have overrun the unit, captured what was left of the survivors. Oh well, sucks to be them. The war went on, and eventually British pulled out of Gallipoli 213,980 troops made up from India, Australia, England, New Zealand, and France died trying to push the Turks out of their positions. The High Command was using 19th century tactics in a 20th century war. At the end of the war, the British began looking for any records of what had happened to the Norfolk Regiment. Families wanted to know what had become of their husbands, sons, relatives, neighbors. All the men from those villages were all missing. Everybody in the town knew everyone in the regiment. The Turkish army handed over all their records, but there was no mention of any of the men being captured or even encountered. During the ensuing interviews, Turkish and German officers told about what they had seen during that fateful battle at Kavak Tepe. There were a few stories told of how a group of British soldiers had been seen running into the forest, encountering a mysterious fog. When the fog had vanished, the soldiers had vanished as well. Had just one Turkish officer told this story, it could have been written off as fantasy. Dozens of both Turkish and German officers, as well as a lot of the soldiers, were telling the exact same story. In 1965, a sailor from New Zealand named Frederick Reichard gave a statement on what he had seen from the deck of his ship. He said he witnessed the strange disappearance of the 5th Norfolk in 1915. He and three other sailors watched as a bunch of strange clouds had formed above the men's position. As they watched, one of the clouds looked like it settled to the ground, covering the soldiers. After an hour or so, the cloud lifted and dissolved into the sky. Once the sailors could see the forest where the Norfolks had been, there was nobody there. To this day, nobody has found any record of the men in the Norfolk Regiment being killed, captured, lost, or anything. No remains have been uncovered and none of their equipment has been found. 266 men charged into battle and disappeared. 1922, the folks living in Horrer Verde were living their lives like anybody else living in Brazil. They had a town of 600 people with a church, school, and a marketplace. 1823, something changed. A visitor to the village discovered the people were all gone. It looked as if everybody had simply walked out of town without bothering to take any personal possessions, or leaving behind any clue as to why they left or where they were going. The authorities were notified and a house to house search ensued. Everything looked as if the occupants had simply stepped out the door but would be right back. In the schoolhouse, they found a note scrawled on a blackboard. It simply said, "There is no salvation." Laying on the floor, they found a pistol with one spent round in it. The pistol had been fired the day before the visitor had arrived, but there was no blood or any bullet holes anywhere in the building. How do you fire a gun inside a building and not hit something? The searchers began to look outside the village, hoping to find some indication of where the villagers had gone, but they found no clues. A theory was thrown out that the folks had run from their homes to avoid contact with rebel forces in the forest around town. Had this been the case, where did they run to? Even years later, the relatives of the missing villagers have not seen or heard from a single one of them. No bodies have ever been found, and they didn't take anything with them. It was all left in the village. How could 600 people all vanish without leaving behind a trace? Why have none of them ever turned up again? To this day, the answer to the disappearance of Ora Verde is still unknown. And yes, that is Organic Man Coffee, Trek Coffee. It's unknown when Urkham, Iowa was established. It was a standard little town that attracted no real attention until 1929. Sometime that year, a traveler entered the town on his way to someplace else. He drove along the streets and became uneasy when he noticed there was nobody around. The traveler stopped at a store and he looked around to see if anybody was there, but he soon came to the conclusion that the town had been abandoned. A photo showed up taken from an airplane that was passing overhead. It showed the town was in a bad state of disrepair. Fields were overgrown and the streets were filled with debris. The buildings were all in need of repair. The Great Depression had just gotten kicked off, and the world had other things to look into other than the state of some small town in Iowa. A driver, on his way to someplace else, stopped at the local gas station to fill up, only to run out of gas just outside of town. When he tried walking back into town, he couldn't find the place. Some folks driving by on Route 41 said they had seen people in town. It looked as if the town was doing all right, but anybody driving into town later was shocked to find the place was falling apart and abandoned. As people began to travel across the country looking for work, caravans would form as people banded together for support. Some of these folks were known as Okies, having come from Oklahoma. One caravan stopped just outside of Urkammer to spend the night. A few of the men went into town to see if they could beg or borrow food for the night. When they arrived in town, they found that the place seemed to be vanishing before their very eyes. Returning to camp, they told people what they had seen, and of course, nobody from camp believed them, so more people went into town to have a look, and when they returned with the exact same stories, it was decided they should pack up and leave. Middle of the night, the entire caravan simply moved on down the road. After the Great Depression was finally resolved, the mystery of Urkammer was still being bandied about. Folks attempting to go have a look for themselves found the town was no longer there. You could find it on a map, but you couldn't find it on the ground. Some folks have come out claiming that this story was made up, kind of like the crash in Roswell or the Laredo incident. They say the town never existed and that the story was just made up on a slow news day. I searched and I found just about as many people say the story of Urkammer is true as those who say that it is not. The world being such a strange place, I would be surprised if this hadn't actually happened. People who fear mysteries will go to great lengths in order to make them go away. The Cyclops was launched May 7th, 1910, by the William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia, and it was placed into service November 7th, 1910, with Lieutenant Commander George Worley in command. Worley had kind of a weird history, seeing as he had actually jumped ship back in 1878 under his real name, Johann Friedrich Weichmann, from Hanover, Germany. He changed his name and he joined the Navy Reserve. Having had a lot of previous maritime experience, he quickly clomb the ladder. The Cyclops sailed under the Navy Auxiliary Service Atlantic Fleet. She was a collier, which meant the ship carried coal. Back then, ships burned coal to create steam. A ship could only travel as far as its coal supply lasted, so the idea of a supply ship carrying nothing but coal was a good idea. These colliers had a very distinct look to them. Most ships with more than one funnel, or smokestack, had them lined up, one in front of the other. The Cyclops had the funnels set side by side. There was a huge superstructure amidship used to move coal from the holds to the ships they were servicing. The bridge was set up above the deck on four steel legs, and there were four enormous towers that resembled antennae mounted on the bridge and the rear structures. The Cyclops voyaged to the Baltic from May to July in 1911, supplying the 2nd Division ships. 1912, she returned to Norfolk, Virginia, and then operated along the East Coast from Newport, Rhode Island to the Caribbean, servicing the fleet during the Mexican American War when the United States Navy occupied Veracruz, Mexico, and the Cyclops was called on to supply ships patrolling the coast of Mexico. When the United States entered World War I, the Cyclops was commissioned in May 1917 with Lieutenant Commander George Worley, aka Weichman, being activated as a Navy officer. The Cyclops crossed the Atlantic several times and sailed along the east coast of the United States and South America many times. The ship sailed from Rio de Janeiro on February 16, 1918, carrying 306 crewmen and passengers. They entered Salvador February 20th. 2 days later, she departed for Baltimore, Maryland, with no stops scheduled in the middle. They were carrying manganese ore. Before leaving port, Commander Worley had submitted a report that the starboard engine had a cracked cylinder and it was not operating. One report claims the Cyclops had been overloaded when it left Rio de Janeiro, but the Navy reports all state the ship was loaded correctly and it was in good enough condition to sail to Baltimore under just one engine. Cyclops was not due in Baltimore until March 13th. There was no way of tracking the ship's progress. A ship would sometimes run into a storm and make it run a little bit late. It wasn't until the Cyclops was reported as overdue that the Navy sent out a call for other ships to keep an eye out for the collier. Shortly it was determined the Cyclops was indeed missing, and a search went into action. Ships passing through the route of travel never found any sign of the Cyclops. No lifeboats, no life preservers, no wooden debris of any kind. Even though the Cyclops was a steel ship, it had tons of wood for decking, stairs, flooring, furniture. About half the ship was actually wood. The Navy never decided that the Cyclops The Navy did decide that the Cyclops must have been fired on by a submarine and sunk without being able to send out a distress call. Wireless transmissions meant a radio message in the form of Morse code could be broadcast to just about anywhere on the planet. Because there was only one channel being used, a distress signal had to be developed to make sending it out quick and easy. SOS was chosen because it was simple and it didn't require translating. It did not stand for Save Our Ship or Save Our Souls. The letter K was also sometimes used. It was a fast way to say, oh crap, we need help. You'd hear somebody just sending out K, K, K. That meant they were under attack. At the end of World War I, Germany had no records of any of its subs sinking any colliers along the U.S. coast. The Navy listed the Cyclops as missing. Its last known position was inside the Bermuda Triangle. Following her fitting out and shakedown, Proteus steamed out of Norfolk, Virginia, November 11th, 1913, on the first of 4 runs to Veracruz to supply coal to the battleships and the cruisers of the Atlantic Fleet off Mexico. William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia used the same blueprints for the Proteus as they had used to build the Cyclops. The two ships were identical. Sailing again from Norfolk on September 25, 1914, Proteus supplied coal, oil, men, and stores for ships of the Atlantic Fleet at Rio de Janeiro and Montevideo. Montevideo. Gah, need more coffee. Montevideo. Assigned to the Navy Overseas Transportation Service, she operated between Norfolk, Boston, and New York City for the next several years. In the aftermath of World War II, the Proteus cruised from Norfolk to replenish the U.S. fleet in the Caribbean. Crossing the Panama Canal 4 times, she delivered fuel and stores to Pearl Harbor in 1920 and Cayey, Peru in 1921. She was decommissioned at Norfolk May 25, 1924, and it was inactive until her name was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register in December 5, 1940. She was sold to the Saguenay Terminal Limited of Montreal, Quebec, March 8, 1941. It's Saginaw. It's not spelled Saginaw, but it's pronounced Saginaw. They began operations in the Canadian Merchant Navy under the command of Master Walter Henry Miller. The Proteus would sail from Canada to South America and back, carrying coal and other heavy loads used in the manufacture of steel. Proteus was lost at sea along with 58 men due to unknown causes November 23, 1941. Being a Canadian registered ship, the Proteus was at risk of being torpedoed by the Germans. German records show no U-boat claim for this vessel. Once again, it was being a collier. It had a very distinct look, and it would have been easily identified. The last known location for the Proteus was in the Bermuda Triangle as well. USS Norreus was one of 4 Proteus-class colliers built for the United States Navy before World War I. The builders, William Cramp and Sons of Philadelphia, where have we heard that name before, had used the same blueprints once again. Named for Norreus, an aquatic deity from Greek mythology, she was the second U.S. Navy vessel to bear the name. If you follow Navy doings, the reuse of names is as common as bad food and long hours. Detached from Navy Overseas Transportation Service September 12, 1919, Norreus served as the Atlantic Fleet until being decommissioned at Norfolk June 30, 1922. The Aluminum Company of Canada bought the Norreus February 27, 1941. Norreus operated out of Montreal carrying bauxite from the Caribbean to aluminum plants in the United States and Canada. Her master was John Thomas Bennett of the Canadian Merchant Navy. Norreus was lost at sea sometime around December 10, 1941, while steaming from St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands, following the same route where her sister ship, the Cyclops, had disappeared. It was carrying ore destined to make aluminum for Allied aircraft. There were 236 people on board when it vanished. Norreus was presumed sunk after being torpedoed by a German U-boat. However, there are no German U-boat claims for this vessel. If you were a U-boat commander and you sunk a ship, you made a note of it in the logbook. This was how you got promoted. It also helped advance your career. Yet, nobody claimed any of these three ships that all went missing in the Bermuda Triangle. 600 men and three ships all vanished without a trace. Picture this: Sicily, 1932. No, China, 1937. This is the story that Star Chaser 2000 had asked me about. This was during the Second Sino-Japanese War in China. In China, they refer to themselves as being the Han, as in the Han Dynasty. In Latin, Han comes out as Sino. So instead of calling it the China-Japanese War, they called it the Sino-Japan War. The war is known as the War of Resistance against Japan by China. After the Boxer Rebellion, all the countries with interests in China were allowed to maintain small military forces to keep their delegates safe. Each country had a few hundred men, but Japan kept sending in more and more soldiers, saying they were just there to keep the embassy safe. Soon, Japan had a large enough force to push most of the Chinese military out of Manchuria. Japan and China were set up on either sides of the Marco Polo Bridge. Japan was occupying a large portion of China, and the bridge was the only means of crossing the Yangtze River. Japan kept sending in more men to guard their side of the river. China complained about this buildup, but Japan, along with the rest of the world, ignored them. To understand this better, in the Great War, the war to end all wars, aka World War I, Japan, as well as Italy, had both been allied with the US, Britain, and France. While Woodrow Wilson and his ilk divvied up all of Europe, making the map more to their liking, Japan was given carte blanche to do as they would in all those Asian countries. Italy was handed an enormous screw and told to, well, go away. Japan started out abusing their power just a little bit, followed by quite a lot, until to a point they were actually abusing wholeheartedly all those Asian countries that they were pretty much allowed to abuse by the rest of the world. It wasn't until Japan began stealing land that had been claimed by the Western countries, the big three, that people began to take notice. You can't have the Philippines, those belong to us. That sort of thing. The Japanese commanders began firing on the Chinese troops, and this led to more Chinese troops being sent to reinforce their positions. One thing led to another, and soon an all out shooting war broke out on both sides of the Marco Polo Bridge. To keep the Japanese out of Nanjing, which was called Nanking, Colonel Li Fu Sin set up a defensive force along the Chinese side of the Marco Polo Bridge. 3,000 heavily armed men with artillery and machine guns were placed along a 2-mile stretch of the river. Once the army was in place, the colonel returned to his bunker for the night. In the morning, the colonel was awoken by a messenger who said they couldn't make contact with the troops along the river. Colonel Li Fu Sin sent a squad to the river to see why the communications were down. The squad returned and told him the men are all gone. The equipment was still there. The machine guns were there along with the artillery. There was ammunition, food, all of the equipment needed to do battle. Everything was ready, except there was nobody there to do the fighting. There was no sign of a mass exodus. It looked as if the men had simply disappeared in the night. Men were sent out to outposts stationed on all sides of the defensive line to try and find out what had happened. None of the soldiers in the outposts knew of what had happened. In the middle of the night, 3,000 men had walked away from their positions without making a sound, and they left everything behind. With nobody to stop them, the Japanese army crossed the bridge and invaded Nanking. Once the city was in the Japanese army's hands, they turned into a frenzied bloodbath, murder and rape. Over 300,000 Chinese civilians were tortured and murdered. When Japan finally surrendered, a search was taken of their records to see if maybe the Japanese had something to do with all those soldiers vanishing. Nothing was found. It was as if 3,000 soldiers simply vanished in a puff of smoke. 1945, a train left from Guangdong, China, en route to Shanghai, about 880 miles. Due to the conditions of the tracks and the engine, well, the trip was going to take all day, between 10 and 20 hours. There were a few hundred people on board, but the records are sketchy as to exact numbers. The train failed to arrive on schedule. So the train master sent a crew south to see if there had been a breakdown or some other possible problem along the tracks. The crew traveled from Shanghai all the way to Guangdong without encountering the train. The tracks were fine, and there was no place to hide a train along the way. The war was still on, but Japan was in a defensive position, trying to hold on to what little they still had. There was no sign of a derailment, and there was no indication that the train had stopped anywhere. There was no place for it to stop. Nothing. There were no sidings, there were no connecting rails. It was just a straight shot from point A to point B. The train, along with somewhere over 200 passengers, had simply disappeared. To this day, there have been no answers to this disappearance either. I used to have the Encyclopedia of World War II. It told the war from the United States and the British side, as well as from the German and the Japanese side of things. It was filled with personal accounts from the men who were there. I read the whole thing, and then one day, needing shelf room, I took the books to Corpus Christi and I sold them at the half price bookstore. A few months later, Fred, the IT guy at work, handed me a bookmark that I had left in the last volume. It was a deposit slip from my bank. He had bought the set of books while visiting Corpus Christi, and he found my bookmark. The Fallschirmjäger, which is German for men who fall from the sky, it's their paratroopers division. They were used in World War II to take out a lot of forts all over the Mediterranean. They would literally drop out of the sky and then hold a position until reinforcements could arrive. Tough cookies. Towards the end of the war, Germany was falling short on everything. Things like parachutes. In a bid to see how this problem could be overcome, the Germans tried experimenting with prisoners to see how far they could survive a drop and how slow the plane had to be traveling. Lots of prisoners were thrown from planes trying to find the magic height and speed. As the war was slowly grinding down, the paratroopers took off in a desperate mission to stop the Allies. I don't know exactly how many men were in the division that went, but those who took off that night, just to guess 15,000, none of them have ever been found. The troops did their duty. They jumped from a plane in the dead of night into the mountainous area so they could sneak up on the Allies. At the end of the war, the Fallschirmjäger had 43,896 enlisted men and 889 officers, all listed as missing. I know not all of these were at the end of the war, but an entire division jumped into the night and they've never been found. They talk about D.B. Cooper disappearing. Well, here's an entire division vanished and they have found not a trace. Not a single piece of equipment has ever come to light. The Devil's Sea, or the Dragon's Triangle, is one of 12 vile vortices, which is a location near the Japanese coast and the Pacific Ocean. A vile vortice is an area where the pull of the planet's electromagnetic waves is very strong. The Devil's Sea is a triangle between Japan and the Isle of Bonin, including a major portion of the Philippine Sea. For hundreds of years, people and ships have vanished inside this three-sided area of water. A Japanese pilot flying over the area saw a 150-foot long dragon thrashing about in the water. 1952, the Japanese government sent out a research vessel, the Kaya Maru No. 5, to investigate the mysteries of the Devil's Sea. The Kaya Maru No. 5 and its crew of 31 people vanished. The Japanese government then declared this area unsafe for marine voyaging and transportation in the 1950s. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Like I said, it's kind of a rehash of some of my past show from 5 years ago. I only have so many minutes in a week, and I used up most of them baking. It got so exciting around here, I had to wash my apron. It looked like I'd been in battle. It was smeared with chocolate chips and raisins and sugar and all the things that you use to make cookies. Well, if you did enjoy the show, tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell people you don't even know they should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. If you didn't enjoy the show, why are you still listening? Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.